James sat in his armchair, savoring the tranquility of the evening when Grace entered with a resolute expression on her face. After 30 years of marriage, her manner was well known to him, yet tonight, something was distinct. He placed his book down, offering her his undivided attention. "James, I need to talk to you," she started, her tone firm yet grave. James nodded, prompting her to go on. She inhaled deeply and revealed, "I'm going on a date with your brother Luke. He's really skilled in lovemaking and intimacy. I want to learn from him to enhance our intimate life. When I return, we'll be together." James's mind blanked momentarily, her words striking him like a blow. He gazed at her, struggling to grasp her announcement. His complexion grew pale and his hands trembled. "You're joking, right?" he uttered, his voice tense. Grace shook her head, her face sincere. "No, I'm serious." "I think this will benefit us." James was engulfed in a storm of confusion, betrayal, and rage. How could she believe this would help their relationship? He stood up suddenly, the chair screeching on the floor. "I need to leave," he declared, his voice cracking, without awaiting her reply. He seized his coat and exited, slamming the door. Outside, the brisk night air barely soothed him. He wandered without direction, his thoughts in turmoil. The betrayal cut deeply, and he felt a mix of sorrow and anger he had never known before. Grace, once the love of his life, now seemed intent on deceiving him with his own brother. The anguish was overwhelming as he roamed the empty streets. A sinister thought took shape in his mind. He could not let this pass. They must realize the consequences of their actions. He spent hours pacing, refining his strategy. By the time he returned home, he was determined this would not only be about revenge, it would be a lesson they would never forget. Back home, he saw Grace sleeping, unaware of the chaos she had instigated. He paused by the bedroom door, a twinge of regret striking him, yet he could not waver. He had to remain firm to carry out his plan. Over the next days, James carefully prepared. He transferred their funds to a new account, covertly sold valuable belongings, and secured a new apartment in another city. He maintained an appearance of normalcy around Grace, even as his resentment intensified each time she smiled at him, reminding himself of her treachery to stay resolved. Finally, the day came. Grace was dressing for her date with Luke, humming cheerfully as she chose her attire. James observed her from the threshold, his feelings a complex blend of fury and sadness. "Enjoy yourself," he said, managing a smile. Grace turned, her eyes alight with anticipation. "Thanks, James. I promise this will be good for us." James nodded, his expression composed. "I hope so." As soon as she departed, he sprang into action. He packed his bags, assembled her pricey items in the living room, and drenched them in gasoline. Lighting a match, he watched as the flames engulfed the pile, feeling a grim satisfaction. This was just the beginning. With everything arranged, he left the apartment, locking the door. He drove to the bank, completed the final transfer, and headed to the airport. As the plane ascended, he peered out the window, leaving his former life and the betrayal behind, resolute to begin anew. James sat alone in his office, a dim lamp casting light over the desk. The betrayal weighed heavily on him, but he knew he needed to stay focused. He started by logging into their joint bank account, a feeling of stern resolve enveloping him. Methodically, he moved their savings to a newly opened account under a different name, each transaction leaving a bitter taste, but he persisted, aware it was vital for his scheme. Next, he listed their costly electronics, jewelry, and art online. He contacted buyers, organizing secret sales to keep a low profile. Each item sold felt like a piece of their shared life fading away, yet it also steeled his determination. He needed to accumulate as much money as possible to carry out his escape. Securing a new apartment was the last step. James explored different cities, finally selecting one far enough to start anew. He leased a modest apartment, making sure it was prepared for his arrival. The new address represented a fresh start, a place to rebuild without the shadow of Grace's betrayal hanging over him. Throughout these preparations, James maintained a facade of normalcy. Grace couldn't suspect anything. He continued their routine, sharing meals and conversations as if nothing had altered. Each interaction tested his composure, a challenge to conceal his anger and sorrow. When she smiled at him, he felt a pang of heartache, but he steeled himself, recalling the pain she had inflicted. At work, James functioned as usual, attending meetings, completing projects, and interacting with colleagues as if everything were normal. His performance remained steady, though internally he grappled with a whirlwind of emotions. Every task completed brought him closer to his goal, reinforcing his determination to see it through. In the evenings, James would sit with Grace, listening to her talk about her day. Her enthusiasm about her upcoming date with Luke was evident, and it required all his strength to remain composed. He nodded and responded appropriately, hiding his seething rage beneath a mask of indifference. Each night, as Grace went to bed, James stayed up late, meticulously planning every detail of his departure. The days leading up to her date were filled with tense anticipation. James finalized his plans, double-checking every detail to ensure nothing was missed. He packed a suitcase with essential items, storing it secretly in the garage. His heart ached at the thought of leaving behind the life he had built, but he knew there was no other choice. On the day of her date, James observed Grace prepare with a feigned calmness. She hummed a tune, unaware of the storm brewing within him. As she left the house, he offered a strange smile and a casual farewell. Once she was gone, James sprang into action. He retrieved his suitcase, loaded it into the car, and took one last look around the house. The home they had shared for decades now felt like a prison, its walls closing in on him. Driving to the bank, James executed the final transfer of funds, emptying their joint account. He withdrew a substantial sum of cash, enough to support him for the first few months in his new city. The clerk at the counter cast him a curious glance, but he ignored it, his focus on the task at hand. Finally, James drove to the airport. He parked the car, checked in for his flight, and passed through security with a sense of surreal detachment. As he boarded the plane, he felt a mix of relief and sorrow. The life he had known was over, replaced by an uncertain future, but he was resolved to embrace it. Grace was vibrant with excitement as she readied for her date with Luke. She hummed a light tune, her anticipation clear in every move. She carefully selected a sleek black dress that highlighted her figure. Standing before the mirror, she applied her makeup with care, ensuring everything was perfect for the evening ahead. In the background, James observed her with a heavy heart. He masked his true emotions, presenting an indifferent facade. His mind raced with the plan he had, meticulously crafted, but he could not let Grace see any sign of his inner turmoil. Each time she looked at him, he forced a smile, nodding at her chatter about the plan she had with Luke. "How do I look?" Grace asked, twirling to show off her outfit. "Stunning," James replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Satisfied, Grace gave him a peck on the cheek. "I'll see you later tonight. Don't wait up," she said cheerfully as she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. As the front door closed behind her, James's smile disappeared. He stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The house was eerily silent without her, amplifying his feelings of betrayal. He shook off the thoughts, knowing he had to act swiftly. James moved with determination, retrieving the cans of gasoline he had stashed earlier. He went through the house, collecting Grace's most valuable items: jewelry, designer clothes, electronics, and other valuables. He piled them in the living room, each item a painful reminder of the life they had shared and the trust she had broken. Once everything was assembled, he drenched the pile with gasoline, the pungent odor filling the air. His hands trembled slightly, but he pushed through, lighting a match and watching as the flames engulfed the pile. The fire crackled and roared, consuming everything in its path. James stood back, a grim sense of satisfaction washing over him as the blaze intensified. With the fire raging, James turned to the next part of his plan. He hurried to the bedroom, packing a suitcase with essential items, clothes, personal documents, and a few cherished mementos went into the bag. He took one last look around the room, memories flooding his mind, but he couldn't dwell on them now. He had to move forward. He made his way to the garage, loading the suitcase into the trunk of his car. The night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the chaos inside the house. James took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Driving away from the house, he didn't look back. His heart ached for the life he was leaving behind, but the betrayal was too deep to forgive. He headed straight to the bank, making the final transfer of funds to his new account. The teller eyed him curiously, but he maintained his composure, completing the transaction quickly. Next, James drove to the airport. He parked, checked in for his flight, and went through security with mechanical efficiency. As he boarded the plane, he felt a sense of finality. The life he had known was gone, replaced by an uncertain future. But in that uncertainty, he found a glimmer of hope, a chance to start anew, free from the betrayal that had shattered his world. James parked his car outside the bank, his mind focused on the final steps of his plan. The weight of the duffel bag, filled with important documents and a few personal belongings, reminded him of the irreversible path he had chosen. He entered the bank, his face a mask of calm determination. Inside, he approached the teller with a steady voice, requesting the last transfer of funds. The teller, a young woman with a friendly smile, processed his request without any sign of suspicion. James watched as the numbers on the screen confirmed the movement of their savings to his new account. Once completed, he politely requested a large cash withdrawal. The teller nodded, counting out the bills efficiently. James's heart pounded as he took the envelope filled with cash, slipping it into his bag. Thanking the teller, he left the bank. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped outside. He walked briskly to his car, each step bringing him closer to his new beginning. With the funds secured, there was no turning back. Driving to the airport, James felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. The city lights blurred past as he navigated the familiar streets for what he knew would be the last time. Memories of his life with Grace flickered through his mind, but he pushed them away, focusing on the future. Upon arriving at the airport, James parked in the long-term lot, making a mental note of his car's location. He grabbed his bag and headed inside, merging into the flow of travelers. The hustle and bustle of the terminal felt oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. At the check-in counter, James presented his ticket and ID. The airline agent processed his information, handing him a boarding pass with a smile. "Have a safe trip," she said. He nodded, thanking her quietly before moving towards security. Navigating through security, James maintained a calm exterior, despite the nerves gnawing at him. He placed his bag on the conveyor belt, walked through the scanner, and retrieved his belongings on the other side. Each step felt like a test of his resolve, but he passed without incident. Finding his gate, James settled into a chair, his mind racing. The minutes dragged by, each one filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He watched the other passengers, their mundane activities a stark contrast to the life-altering decision he had made. His phone buzzed with a message from Grace, asking when he'd be home. He ignored it, feeling a pang of guilt mixed with anger. Finally, the boarding announcement came over the intercom. James stood, joining the line of passengers. His heart pounded as he handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who scanned it and wished him a pleasant flight. Stepping onto the plane, James felt the weight of his old life begin to lift, replaced by a tentative sense of freedom. He found his seat, stowed his bag, and buckled in as the plane taxied to the runway. James gazed out the window, the city he had called home for decades shrinking below him. The engines roared to life, and with a rush of speed, the aircraft lifted off the ground. As the plane ascended, James felt a surge of mixed emotions. Relief washed over him, tempered by the sadness of leaving everything behind. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he also recognized the necessity of his escape. The city lights faded into darkness, and James closed his eyes, ready to embrace whatever came next. This journey was the first step toward a new life, free from betrayal and filled with possibilities. Grace stepped out of the car, a wide smile on her face after her evening with Luke. The excitement of the night still lingered as she walked towards the apartment, her mind full of memories from the evening, oblivious to the scene that awaited her inside. She unlocked the door and entered, calling out for James, but was met with an eerie silence. The smell hit her first acrid and smoky, it clawed at her throat. Panic surged as she rushed into the living room, only to be confronted by a scene of devastation. Her valuable possessions, reduced to charred remnants, lay in a smoldering heap. Jewelry, designer clothes, electronics, everything she had cherished was now ash and ruin. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what had happened. She stumbled through the apartment, searching for any sign of James. The emptiness of each room amplified her fear. His clothes were gone, his belongings missing. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. On the kitchen counter, she spotted a folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up and unfolded it. James's handwriting was unmistakable. The note was brief, but its impact was profound. Grace, your betrayal cut deeper than you can imagine. This is the consequence of your actions. I hope you find what you're looking for with Luke. As for me, I'm moving on. Don't try to find me. James, her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, the note slipping from her fingers. The gravity of what she had done crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had been so caught up in her excitement with Luke, so confident in her plans to spice up their relationship, that she had completely misjudged James's reaction. Now she was paying the price. Tears welled up in her eyes as she surveyed the destruction around her. This wasn't just a loss of material possessions, it was the obliteration of the life they had built together. Memories of happier times flashed through her mind, now tainted by her betrayal and James's desperate act of revenge. The silence in the apartment was oppressive, filled with the echoes of their past. Grace felt a pang of regret so intense it was almost physical. She had wanted to improve their relationship, but in her selfishness she had destroyed it completely. Her actions had driven away the man she had spent 3 decades with, leaving her alone amidst the ruins of their life. Grace picked up the note again, reading James's words over and over. The finality of it struck her each time he was gone. The man she thought she knew had responded in a way she never expected, showing her just how deeply she had wounded him. She stood up, her legs unsteady, and wandered through the apartment once more. Each room, now empty and silent, was a stark reminder of her choices. The realization hit her that she was truly alone, left to face the consequences of her actions. The gravity of her betrayal had not only cost her James, but also the stability and security of her life. As she stood in the charred remains of their living room, Grace felt a mixture of sorrow and guilt. She had underestimated the man she had spent 30 years with, and now she was paying the price. The reality of her actions and the consequences they had wrought were painfully clear. Grace was left with nothing but the harsh truth of her betrayal and the desolate aftermath of her decisions. Grace sat in the living room, the remnants of her possessions still smoldering, when a sharp knock echoed through the apartment. She opened the door to find 2 police officers standing there, their expressions serious. "Mrs. Thompson," one of them asked, showing his badge. "We need to talk to you about the fire." Her heart sank. She stepped aside to let them in, her mind racing. The officers entered, glancing around at the charred remains. "What happened here?" one of them asked, his tone professional but probing. Grace stammered, trying to explain. "I came home and found everything like this. I don't know what happened. My husband, he must have done this before he left." The officers exchanged glances. "Mrs. Thompson, we're investigating this fire as a potential arson. There are also questions about insurance fraud. We need you to come with us to the station for further questioning." Shock washed over her. "Arson? Insurance fraud? I had nothing to do with this," she protested, but the officers remained firm. "We understand this is difficult, but we need to follow protocol," the other officer said. "Please come with us." At the police station, Grace was led to a small interrogation room. She sat at the table, nerves frayed as the officers questioned her about the events leading up to the fire. They asked about her relationship with James, his sudden departure, and her financial situation. Each question felt like a new weight pressing down on her. Hours later, she was allowed to leave, but the investigation was far from over. As she stepped out of the station, her phone buzzed with a message from her bank. She read it with growing horror. All her accounts had been frozen. Panic surged through her as she realized the full extent of her predicament. Grace rushed to the nearest ATM to check her balances, hoping there was some mistake. She inserted her card and punched in her PIN, only to see a 0 balance staring back at her. She tried another account with the same result. Her savings, everything she had relied on, was gone. Back at the apartment, she tried calling the bank, but they confirmed her worst fears. Due to the ongoing investigation, all her assets were frozen. Her access to money was cut off completely. The reality of her situation crashed down on her. She was under suspicion, financially crippled, and utterly alone. Desperation clawed at her. She called Luke, explaining the situation in a rush. He listened, but seemed distant, his support wavering as the gravity of her situation became clear. "I don't know how much I can help, Grace," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "This is serious." The isolation was suffocating. Grace's thoughts spiraled as she tried to grasp the enormity of her predicament. Her husband was gone, her possessions destroyed, and now she was facing potential legal consequences. The life she had known had disintegrated in a matter of days. She contacted a lawyer, hoping to find a way out of the mess. The lawyer's demeanor was calm but serious as they discussed the charges. "This is a complex case," the lawyer said. "We'll need to gather evidence to prove your innocence and untangle the financial issues. It won't be easy and it will take time." Grace nodded, her mind a whirlwind of anxiety and regret. Each step she took seemed to lead deeper into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The gravity of her actions and their repercussions weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the betrayal that had set everything in motion. As she sat alone in the empty apartment, the silence was deafening. The investigation, the frozen assets, and the legal troubles were more than she could have ever anticipated. She had underestimated James's reaction, and now she was trapped in a web of consequences from which there seemed to be no escape. Grace's phone buzzed incessantly, pulling her from a restless sleep. She reached for it, her heart sinking as she saw the flood of notifications. Her social media accounts were exploding with comments, messages, and tags. Confused, she opened one of the messages and saw a link to a video. With trembling hands, she clicked on it. The video started with James looking somber and composed, addressing the camera. "This is the truth about my wife, Grace," he began. He detailed their 30 years of marriage and then dropped the bombshell about her affair with his brother Luke. He spoke. Images of Grace and Luke together, clearly taken without their knowledge, flashed on the screen. The video ended with James's heartbreaking message about betrayal and moving on. Grace felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. The video was expertly edited, making her infidelity and deceit painfully clear. Comments poured in, full of judgment and scorn. People she knew, and even strangers, were condemning her, labeling her a homewrecker and worse. The video spread like wildfire, shared across various platforms. News outlets picked it up, adding to her public disgrace. Everywhere she turned, there were reminders of her betrayal and the humiliation it had caused. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Neighbors avoided her, friends turned their backs, and even colleagues at work distanced themselves. Her reputation was shattered. Desperate for support, Grace tried calling Luke. His phone went straight to voicemail. She left messages, growing increasingly frantic with each one. She needed to talk to him, to figure out what to do next, but there was no response. Days passed, and her attempts to reach him became futile. Determined to find him, Grace decided to visit his apartment. When she arrived, she was met with an empty, trashed place. Papers were strewn about, furniture overturned, the place looked abandoned. Among the chaos, she found letters from creditors demanding payment for overdue debts. It became clear that Luke had vanished, leaving behind a trail of financial ruin. Grace's heart pounded as she sifted through the mess, realizing the extent of Luke's irresponsibility. Angry creditors had begun calling her, demanding repayment for loans she had no knowledge of. Luke had not only disappeared but had also dragged her further into his financial disaster. The weight of his debts now loomed over her, compounding her misery. The relentless media coverage and the viral video left Grace with nowhere to hide. Each day brought new waves of public scorn. Strangers recognized her on the street, whispering behind her back or confronting her with harsh words. She became a pariah in her own community. Every aspect of her life laid bare for public consumption. Grace's isolation deepened as she grappled with the consequences of her actions. The legal troubles, frozen assets, and public humiliation were more than she could bear. She felt trapped, her world collapsing around her. Luke's disappearance was the final blow, leaving her to face the fallout alone. In her darkest moments, she realized the full extent of her betrayal. James's video had not only exposed her affair but had also revealed the fragility of the life she had taken for granted. The pain and anger she had caused were now mirrored in her own suffering. She had lost everything: her husband, her possessions, her reputation, and now even the man she had risked it all for. As Grace sat in the ruins of her life, the enormity of her actions and their repercussions became painfully clear. She was left to navigate the wreckage, facing the harsh reality of the choices she had made and the devastation they had wrought. Grace wandered through the quiet apartment, her heart heavy with regret and longing. In the midst of the chaos and isolation, she stumbled upon a small envelope tucked under a familiar book on the shelf. Curiosity piqued. She opened it cautiously, finding a handwritten note inside. "My dearest Grace," the note began, James's familiar handwriting sending a pang of nostalgia through her. "If you're reading this, I hope you'll understand why I had to leave. Follow the clues I've left behind, and you'll find answers confusion and hope wed within her." As she read on, James had always been meticulous, even in his anger. The first clue led her to their favorite park, where they had shared countless picnics and lazy Sunday afternoons. Beneath a bench they often sat on, she found another note, directing her to a restaurant where they had celebrated their anniversary. With each clue, Grace retraced their memories together, each location a poignant reminder of their life before it all fell apart. The notes were cryptic yet filled with love, a dark contrast to the pain she had caused. She followed them dutifully, each step bringing her closer to understanding James's intentions. At the last location, a secluded spot overlooking the city skyline, Grace found a final note. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read James's heartfelt words. He spoke of forgiveness, of letting go of the anger that had consumed him. "I can't forget what happened," he wrote, "but I hope you can find peace." Grace stood there, the city lights twinkling below, feeling a mix of gratitude and sorrow. James's clues had led her on a journey of introspection, forcing her to confront the consequences of her actions. She had hurt him deeply, shattered their life together, yet here he was, offering her closure and a chance to move forward. Determined to make amends, Grace embarked on a new mission to find James and confront him not with excuses or apologies, but with newfound understanding of their shared past and the strength to rebuild their fractured trust. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was willing to try to prove that their love was worth fighting for. With the final clue in hand, Grace set out on her quest, driven by hope and the belief that their story wasn't over yet. She had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but she was ready to face them head-on. As she walked away from the overlook, a sense of determination settled within her, guiding her towards a future where forgiveness and redemption awaited. Grace's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend, Sophia, whom she hadn't spoken to in years. "Grace, I just saw the news. I'm here for you. Let's meet up," the message read. Surprised and grateful, Grace quickly replied, arranging to meet Sophia at a quiet cafe later that day. As Grace sipped her coffee, Sophia arrived with a comforting smile. They exchanged a hug, and Sophia wasted no time in expressing her support. "Grace, I can't believe what's happened. James's video, it's all over the news. How are you holding up?" Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she recounted the events of the past days, the fire, the frozen assets, and now James's disappearance. Sophia listened attentively, her empathy evident. "I'm here to help, Grace. We'll figure this out together," Sophia reassured her. Over the next few days, Grace found herself surrounded by unexpected allies. Old friends, former colleagues, even acquaintances who had heard about her situation and reached out. They offered emotional support, practical advice, and even resources to aid in her search for James. Each gesture of kindness bolstered her spirits and gave her hope. Among her allies was Benjamin, a tech-savvy friend who volunteered to help Grace piece together James's plan. They gathered in Grace's temporary apartment, spreading out notes, clues, and memories of James. Benjamin, with his analytical mind, meticulously organized the information, connecting dots that Grace hadn't noticed before. "Look here," Benjamin pointed at a timeline of events they had constructed. "James didn't just disappear randomly, he planned this carefully, from the video to the clues he left you. It's all part of a strategy." Grace nodded, absorbing Benjamin's insights. Piece by piece, they unraveled James's meticulous plan for revenge. His actions weren't impulsive but deliberate, each move calculated to make her confront the consequences of her betrayal. It was painful to see how deeply he had been hurt and how carefully he had planned his response. As they worked late into the night, Grace felt a mix of emotions: guilt for her actions, sorrow for the pain she had caused James, but also determination to set things right. With Benjamin's help, she began to understand James's perspective better, his need for closure and justice. With newfound clarity, Grace started to see a path forward. She couldn't undo the past, but she could try to make amends. "Thank you, Benjamin," she said gratefully as they wrapped up their session. "You've helped me see things differently." Benjamin smiled warmly. "We'll find him, Grace, and when we do, you'll have a chance to make things right." Grace nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. With her unexpected allies by her side, she was ready to face the challenges ahead. Together, they would unravel James's plan and hopefully find a way to heal the wounds of their shattered marriage. Days turned into weeks as Grace tirelessly pursued any lead that might bring her closer to James. With the help of her allies, she uncovered traces of his movements, hotel stays, rental agreements, and sporadic sightings reported by acquaintances in different cities. One evening, a message from an old colleague, Lisa, brought Grace to a bustling city on the West Coast. Lisa had seen someone resembling James at a local cafe, describing his attire and demeanor. Heart racing, Grace ventured into the cafe, scanning the faces until she spotted him sitting alone in a corner booth. James looked different, older, wearier, but the familiarity in his eyes was unmistakable. He glanced up as Grace approached, his expression a mix of surprise and resignation. They locked eyes for a moment, words unspoken but understood. "James," Grace began softly, sliding into the seat opposite him. "I found you," he nodded, his gaze steady. "I knew you would." Silence hung heavy between them, charged with the weight of years of shared history and recent pain. Grace searched for the right words, unsure where to begin. "Why did you leave like that?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. James sighed, his hands clasped together on the table. "I needed time," he admitted quietly, "time to think, to process everything." Grace nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "You didn't have to disappear," she murmured. "We could have worked through it together." He met her gaze, his eyes tired but resolute. Maybe he conceded, but I needed space. I needed to find a way to move forward. Their conversation unfolded slowly, each word a step towards understanding and reconciliation. James shared glimpses of the pain he had endured, the betrayal that had shattered his trust. Grace listened, her heart breaking with every revelation. "I didn't know how else to make you understand," James confessed, his voice raw with emotion. "I thought leaving was the only way to protect myself." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she reached across the table, tentatively touching his hand. "I'm so sorry, James," she whispered. "I never meant to hurt you like this," he nodded, his grip tightening on her hand. "I know," he murmured, "but we can't go back. We can only move forward from here." They sat in silence for a while longer, the cafe bustling around them. Grace felt a glimmer of hope amidst the pain, a chance to rebuild what they had lost, to forge a new path together. Despite everything, she knew deep down that their love was worth fighting for. As they left the cafe hand in hand, Grace felt a sense of peace settling over her. They had a long road ahead, filled with challenges and uncertainties, but they would face them together. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe in a future where forgiveness and redemption were possible. Grace and James walked along the quiet streets of the city, the cool evening a welcome respite from the emotional turmoil of their reunion. They found a secluded bench in a nearby park, sitting side by side, their thoughts heavy with unspoken words. After a long silence, James finally spoke, his voice measured yet filled with a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "Grace, there's something I need to tell you," he began, his eyes focused on the ground before him. "The past months have been difficult, but there's more to why I left." Grace nodded, her heart pounding in anticipation. She had waited for this moment, knowing that understanding James's perspective was crucial to their reconciliation. "I didn't just leave to escape the pain," James continued, his tone steady. "I had to come to terms with everything that happened, to find a way to forgive you and myself." Grace listened intently as James unraveled the layers of his emotions, revealing the depth of his struggle to rebuild trust and redefine their relationship. He spoke of his journey towards acceptance, of the moments of doubt, and the gradual realization that forgiveness was the only path forward. "As much as I was hurt," James admitted softly, "I also needed to understand why it happened. I needed to understand your perspective." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she absorbed his words. She had never fully grasped the impact of her actions until now, the pain she had caused, the trust she had shattered. James's honesty laid bare the wounds she had inflicted, urging her to confront the consequences of her choices. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I never meant to hurt you like this." He turned to her, his gaze searching hers with a mixture of sadness and compassion. "I know," he replied gently, "and I believe you." Their conversation continued late into the night, each revelation bringing them closer together. Grace shared her own journey of reflection and remorse, acknowledging the mistakes she had made and the lessons she had learned along the way. As dawn approached, they sat in silence once more, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Grace realized that forgiveness was not just about words but about actions, about rebuilding trust and embracing vulnerability. Together, they walked back to James's new apartment, a sense of peace settling over them. They had faced their demons, confronted their past, and emerged stronger for it. As they embraced in the quiet of the morning, Grace knew that their journey was far from over, but they were finally on the path towards healing together. As Grace sat by the window of her temporary apartment, the city buzzed with life outside, indifferent to the turmoil within her heart. She traced the rim of her coffee mug with a finger, lost in thought. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, reconciliation with James, introspection, and the beginnings of forgiveness. Yet, amidst the newfound peace, uncertainty lingered like a shadow. She had come a long way since discovering James's departure in the aftermath of her choices. Their reunion had offered a glimpse of hope, a chance to mend what had been broken. But now, with the initial rush of emotions fading, Grace faced a daunting question: what next? Grace's career, once a source of fulfillment, now felt like a distant memory. Her friendships had frayed under the weight of scandal, leaving her with few confidants. The future loomed ahead, a vast expanse of possibilities and unknowns. Part of her yearned for revenge against the circumstances that had led her here, against Luke's betrayal, against her own mistakes. The desire for justice simmered within her, a reminder of the pain she had endured, but vengeance seemed hollow compared to the complexities of her emotions. Redemption beckoned a path fraught with challenges and self-discovery. Grace pondered the lessons she had learned, the insights gained from her journey of reflection. Could she find a way to atone for her actions, to rebuild trust and reclaim her integrity? And then there was the prospect of rebuilding a daunting yet hopeful endeavor. Could she and James forge a new beginning, one rooted in honesty and resilience? Was there still a chance to create a future together despite the scars of the past? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city skyline, Grace made a silent vow she would not let her mistakes define her. She would face the uncertainty with courage, guided by the lessons of forgiveness and resilience. The story ended with Grace gazing out into the twilight, her reflection mirrored in the window pane. The reader was left to wonder about her final decision. Would she choose revenge, redemption, or the challenging path of rebuilding her life? Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: Grace's journey was far from over, and the choices she made would shape her future in ways she had yet to discover.